There are moments in music history when a single musician reshapes the sound of an entire generation, yet his name rarely appears in the spotlight he helped create. In the quiet corners of old Detroit studios, you can still feel the pulse of a bass line that once carried the heartbeat of Motown. And behind that unmistakable rhythm stood James Jamerson, a man whose genius remained hidden in the shadows while the world danced to his work. How does someone so essential become so overlooked? How does a man who shaped the soul of American music fade into silence? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Long before James Jamerson helped shape the sound that would define Motown, his story began in the quiet stillness of Edisto Island, South Carolina. He was born on the 29th of January 1936, into a working-class environment where life demanded endurance and music served as one of the few sources of comfort. His mother, Elizabeth, worked as a domestic laborer, and his father held steady work in the shipyards. Resources were limited, but the emotional richness of his upbringing shaped the sensitivity he would later bring to the bass. Much of his early life unfolded under the care of his grandmother and aunt, both deeply rooted in gospel, blues, and the day-to-day rhythms of the rural South. Their home was filled with songs of faith and sorrow, with melodies rising in the early hours and fading long after sunset. These sounds seeped into young James Jamerson's imagination, forming a foundation he wouldn't fully recognize until years later. Music wasn't a pursuit, it was part of the air he breathed. When he was a boy, a severe biking accident left him in a wheelchair for nearly a year. Doctors prescribed high-top corrective shoes, and the injury created a slight limp that he carried throughout his life. The limp made him self-conscious, quiet, and reserved. Yet within that stillness was a growing internal world, a world of rhythm, harmony, and feeling that would eventually find expression through his musicianship. The accident didn't weaken him, it redirected him. It taught him patience, sensitivity, and the importance of listening. Everything changed in 1953 when his mother moved to Detroit in search of steadier work. 1 year later, she sent for him. Detroit in that era was a place of possibility, especially for families migrating from the South. Factories were hiring, neighborhoods were growing, and the music scene was transforming into a vibrant blend of jazz, blues, and emerging R&B. The city was alive with sound brass horns echoing from nightclubs, church choirs shaking wooden floors, and local bands rehearsing in basements and garages. It was at Northwestern High School where destiny found James Jamerson. One day, he noticed an upright bass lying on the floor of the music room. It was unclaimed, slightly worn, and overlooked. When he picked it up, something clicked. The instrument felt familiar, as though it had been waiting for him. The deep resonance of the strings, the physical weight of the wood, and the soulful vibration that followed each note formed an instant connection. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a voice. He wasn't the kind of musician who practiced scales relentlessly in isolation. Instead, he learned by absorbing everything around him. Joining the school jazz band opened doors into Detroit's thriving musical network. Soon, he found himself attending jam sessions where seasoned musicians like Kenny Burrell, Yusuf Lateef, and Hank Jones shaped his understanding of tone and improvisation. These nights, smoky, crowded, filled with possibility, gave him lessons no classroom could replicate. By his late teens, James Jamerson was performing at weddings, local dances, fraternity parties, and small clubs. His upright bass often stuck out of his car window because the instrument was too large to fit inside. People around Detroit began recognizing him simply by the sight of that bass riding beside him. He became known as a dependable young musician who could adapt to any style: jazz one night, blues the next, R&B the following morning. His reputation grew long before he had any idea where it would lead. He received a music scholarship to Wayne State University but turned it down. He was already earning money through performance, already feeling the heartbeat of Detroit's musical life, and already investing himself fully in the craft. College theory couldn't compete with the thrill of live performance. Around this time, he married Annie Wells, stepping into adulthood with a sense of purpose and responsibility. After high school, he began performing with Washboard, Willie, and the Super Suds of Rhythm. The group exposed him to blues in a way he had never experienced before: raw, human, unpolished. Yet on other gigs, he immersed himself in jazz, building technical strength and emotional nuance. It was a dual education. One genre taught him discipline and structure, the other taught him storytelling and soul. During this period, he also began drinking, a shift that seemed minor at the time but foreshadowed deeper struggles ahead. By the late 1950s, James Jamerson had become a rising talent in Detroit. Producers and local labels began to notice his unique approach to the bass, melodic, fluid, and expressive, in ways that were uncommon. His lines didn't just support the song, they carried emotion, they told stories. And without knowing it, he was preparing for the moment that would one day bring him to a small house on West Grand Boulevard, a place soon to be known as Hitsville, USA, where his destiny and Motown's future would collide. By the late 1950s, James Jamerson was no longer just another young bassist trying to find his way in Detroit. He had become a quiet force, someone musicians whispered about, someone producers kept an eye on, someone whose playing carried a natural authority that didn't need to shout to be felt. Detroit was a city in motion during this period, alive with the pulse of jazz, blues, and the early stirrings of what would soon become a new era of American music. And in the middle of that musical crossroads, James Jamerson was finding his voice. His rise began in 1958 when Northern Records owner Johnny May Matthews invited him to participate in recording sessions. In those days, small labels were scattered across Detroit, each hoping to discover the next sound that would take hold of the country. Most bassists kept to a simple, predictable foundation, but James Jamerson approached the instrument differently. He treated the bass as a storyteller, using movement and melodic lines to give emotional shape to the music. It didn't take long for other labels Fortune, Tri-Fi, and Anna Records to notice the distinctiveness of his playing. Studio sessions became his new classroom. Instead of textbooks and professors, he learned from microphones, engineers, singers, and the pressure of needing to get a perfect take in a single pass. His upright bass would often be the first thing producers heard when building a new song, because they trusted his instincts. He gave songs a heartbeat before the melody was even written. That talent made him invaluable, and soon he was recording almost every week. Meanwhile, Detroit's live music scene kept sharpening his skills. James Jamerson performed at clubs and bars crowded with audiences who wanted to feel something real. These venues were raw and unpredictable. Fights broke out. Glasses shattered. The air filled with smoke thick enough to blur the stage lights. But none of it fazed him. Night after night, he stood behind his upright bass, letting his hands glide across the strings with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what the music needed. His work with school friends like Richard Popcorn Wiley and Clifford Mack led to small touring opportunities and even local hits. When he played on the Platters, With This Ring, a song written by Wiley, it marked one of his earliest brushes with national success. James Jamerson was still a young man, but people in Detroit already considered him something special. As his reputation grew, he drove around the city with his massive upright bass sticking out of his car window, a sight that became almost iconic. Musicians recognized him on the road long before they met him in person. That upright bass, worn and towering, became a symbol of his dedication and relentless work ethic. All the while, James Jamerson continued to absorb everything he could from different genres. The blues taught him sincerity, jazz gave him technique, R&B gave him structure. Together, these influences shaped a style that no one else was playing. Detroit producers began calling him not because he was available, but because they needed him. The turning point was nearing, even if he didn't see it coming. His journey through tiny studios and smoky bars was leading him toward a remodeled house on West Grand Boulevard, a modest building that would soon become the most influential recording space in America. And once James Jamerson walked through those doors, nothing in American music would ever be the same. The real turning point in James Jamerson's career arrived when he stepped into a small, remodeled house on West Grand Boulevard. From the outside, it looked ordinary, just another Detroit residence with its white siding, narrow porch, and modest windows. But inside, it held the heartbeat of a revolution waiting to happen. This was the building that would soon become known as Hitsville, USA, the center of Motown Records. And for James Jamerson, it was the moment when his quiet gifts would collide with a movement that needed exactly what he had to offer. At first, he was simply invited to play on local sessions. nothing more than small projects that came through as the label was finding its identity. But the producers quickly noticed something unusual. James Jamerson didn't play bass the way others did. Instead of staying strictly on the roots, he moved through notes with the fluidity of a horn player. He treated the instrument like a living voice, lifting melodies instead of just supporting them. Songs suddenly had more color, more momentum, more emotional depth. The musicians around him felt it immediately. It wasn't long before he found his musical family, the group of players who later became known as the Funk Brothers. Benny Benjamin with his deep, effortless groove, Joe Messina and Robert White with their nimble guitar lines, Earl Van Dyke with the powerful piano chords that anchored so many early Motown hits. Together, they created a chemistry that couldn't be reproduced or taught. And right at the center of that chemistry stood James Jamerson, his bass creating the foundations upon which countless legendary records would be built. In 1961, he made a decision that changed everything. He switched from his upright bass to the newly introduced Fender Precision bass. The instrument allowed him to explore ideas that the upright couldn't fully express. The electric tone was punchier, clearer, and more defined. Producers loved it, singers felt it, and audiences would soon hear it on nearly every track Motown released. Sometimes he even doubled his lines, first recording on the upright, then layering the Fender on top to give the bass line a subtle but powerful drive. His touch was so precise that few listeners ever realized two instruments were playing. As Motown grew, so did the demand for James Jamerson. Recording sessions multiplied. Producers and arrangers delayed dates if he wasn't available. Songs that would become national hits, songs that shaped the identity of a generation, relied on his presence. And while many bassists of the era were content to stay in the background, James Jamerson elevated the role to something entirely new. With every note, he pushed boundaries. With every line, he redefined what the bass could be. He traveled to Chicago to record for labels like VJ and Brunswick, contributing to hits by John Lee Hooker and Jackie Wilson. He worked on backdoor sessions for Detroit entrepreneurs who valued his sound so much they paid extra for it. Everywhere he went, musicians took notice. His bass line wasn't just part of the music, it was becoming the soul of the music. By the early 1960s, James Jamerson stood on the edge of greatness. Even if the world didn't know his name yet, he had found his voice, found his collaborators, and found the place where his genius could flourish. The next step, his rise to Motown's peak era, was no longer a question. It was inevitable. By the early 1960s, the sound of Motown was beginning to take shape, and at the core of that unmistakable energy was James Jamerson. While the world focused on the voices up front, the Supremes, the Temptations, the Four Tops, there was another voice pulsing beneath every track. It wasn't sung, it wasn't spoken, it was played, and it belonged to him. His bass didn't simply support the music, it carried it, lifting each melody and giving it the heartbeat that listeners around the country would come to recognize instantly. Inside the walls of Hitsville, USA, the magic was almost routine. Songs were born in cramped rooms, filled with cigarette smoke, late-night laughter, and the constant hum of determination. But no matter how crowded the space became, everyone knew when James Jamerson walked in. His presence brought a sense of calm certainty. Producers felt it, musicians depended on it, singers trusted it, and listeners, without ever knowing his name, fell in love with it. Motown's rise was rapid, and James Jamerson's fingerprints were on almost every breakthrough. His lines danced through the Supremes' early hits, turned the Temptations' records into living, breathing stories, and gave the Four Tops a foundation so solid that their songs still stand tall today. He reinvented what a bass line could be. Where others played safe, he played bold. Where others stayed on the route, he moved with the freedom of a jazz soloist, crafting melodic runs that felt simple at first, but revealed astonishing complexity upon closer listening. The sessions were relentless. Some days he played on 3, 4, even 5 tracks. Still, James Jamerson never approached a song the same way twice. He treated each one as an opportunity to explore a new pocket, a new rhythm, a new shade of emotion. If Motown was building a musical empire, then he was quietly laying its bricks one bass line at a time. His genius reached a profound moment when Marvin Gaye began working on the album that would change American music. What's Going On? Gaye insisted on having James Jamerson on the project. According to those who were there, he searched Detroit until he found him. And when James Jamerson finally played the iconic line for the title track, he did it while sitting on the floor, gripping the Fender Precision bass like it was part of his own body. The result was historic. The bass line didn't just accompany the message of the song, it deepened it, turning it into something spiritual, something rooted in the pulse of real human experience. As Motown expanded its reach, James Jamerson joined tours, studio sessions, and special projects that pushed his influence far beyond Detroit. He played on movie themes, commercials, and sessions in Chicago and Los Angeles. Artists like Jackie Wilson, The Spinners, Dionne Warwick, and Robert Palmer turned to him for the same reason Motown did. His touch transformed good music into unforgettable music. During these years, James Jamerson reached a level few musicians ever see. He wasn't a star in the traditional sense. There were no magazine covers, no bright spotlights, no screaming crowds, but he was the backbone of an entire generation's sound. At the height of Motown's success, he was in the center of the storm, shaping a legacy that would outlive the very era he helped define. Even at the height of Motown's success, when the label's hits dominated radio stations across the country and the world could feel the energy of a musical revolution, shadows were beginning to form around James Jamerson. Fame, even when it doesn't belong directly to you, comes with pressures that are not always seen. And for a man who carried his emotions quietly, the weight of those pressures began to settle in ways that no one fully recognized at the time. The first signs emerged as Motown's recording schedules intensified. With demand skyrocketing, the label expanded its roster of musicians. New bassists were hired not because they could replace James Jamerson, but because the workload had become impossible for one person to handle. Yet to a man whose artistry came from instinct, community, and improvisation, the arrival of new players felt like the first tremor of change. Motown's music was evolving, and the environment that once felt intimate was becoming more structured, more ridged, more dependent on written charts than on the spontaneous chemistry that had defined the early days. James Jamerson had always thrived on feel. He listened with his entire body, responding to the drummer, the singer, the smallest shift in groove. But as arrangements became increasingly pre-written, he found himself boxed into formats that restricted his natural freedom. The magic that once flowed effortlessly started to feel confined. And confinement, for an artist like him, carried emotional consequences. Then came the loss that shook him deeply. Benny Benjamin, his close friend and the rhythmic partner who had shaped so many Motown classics beside him, passed away after years of battling addiction. Their connection had been rooted not just in music, but in trust. Benny understood James Jamerson's phrasing, his timing, his instincts. Losing him meant losing a piece of the foundation that had made Motown's sound so powerful. Without Benny's steady presence, the studio felt different, emptier, colder, less like home. At the same time, the nightlife that had once offered release now brought complications. James Jamerson's relationship with alcohol grew heavier. Long hours, emotional pressure, and the constant push to create took a toll. Drinking numbed the edges, softened the weight, and quieted the noise. But it also began to blur the clarity of his focus, introducing unpredictability into a career built on excellence. Producers who once depended on him started noticing small changes, late arrivals, moments of exhaustion, days when he seemed distant. Yet many still defended him, believing no one could replicate what he brought to a recording. His genius had always outweighed his struggles, but the margin was tightening. Meanwhile, Motown itself was changing. The label was growing beyond Detroit, adopting a more polished, commercial sound. The raw, soulful spontaneity of the early Hitsville sessions was giving way to a corporate vision aimed at national expansion. For some, it was progress. For James Jamerson, it was the slow fading of a world he had helped build from the ground up. He was still at the top of his craft, still essential, still brilliant. But underneath the glory, the first cracks were forming. A storm was gathering quietly, invisibly, and as Motown marched toward its next chapter, James Jamerson was stepping into a future that would test him in ways the early days never had. When Motown made the decision to leave Detroit for Los Angeles in 1973, the change marked far more than a geographic shift. For many musicians who had built the label from the ground up, it represented the end of a familiar world, the end of the cramped rooms, the late-night sessions, the spontaneous creativity that had defined the Hitsville era. For James Jamerson, the move carried a deeper weight. Detroit had been the city where he found his purpose, his community, and his voice. Leaving it meant leaving behind the environment that had allowed his genius to flourish. He followed Motown to Los Angeles, determined to continue contributing to the label he had helped build. But the transition was not smooth. Los Angeles was bigger, colder in its own way, more competitive, and far more fragmented than the tight-knit Detroit scene. The studios were larger, the sessions more formal, the expectations different. Where Detroit had felt like family, Los Angeles felt like an industry. And for someone who thrived on human connection, the difference was profound. James Jamerson had always relied on instinct, emotion, and the subtle communication between musicians in a room. In Los Angeles, much of that was replaced with isolation headphones, strict charts, and an atmosphere that left little room for the intuitive magic he had once contributed so effortlessly. The newer musicians didn't share the history he carried. They respected him, but they didn't know him, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to feel like a stranger in a world that no longer understood the language he spoke. The pressure mounted. Work was still coming in, sometimes more than he could handle, but the spark that had once defined his playing began to dim. Alcohol, which had once seemed like a coping mechanism, now became something heavier. Nights that used to be spent among friends turned into long hours alone. Bottles replaced conversations. Silence replaced inspiration. And the man whose bass lines once carried the emotion of entire songs now found himself struggling to carry his own. Friends who had known him during the Detroit years noticed the changes. His once effortless confidence became uneven. His health wavered. There were moments when he seemed present, sharp, and fully himself, and then moments when he drifted lost in memories, or in pain, or in the weight of expectations he could no longer maintain. His hands still knew what to do, but his spirit was tired. There were stories of missed sessions, of nights when he couldn't perform at the level he expected of himself. For a man whose identity had been built on excellence, every slip felt devastating. And yet, there was a quiet dignity in the way he tried to keep going, even as the cracks deepened. He wasn't just fighting the pressures of an industry in transition. He was fighting his own body, his own mind, and the loneliness that had crept in through the spaces success could no longer fill. The crisis didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, one missed call, one restless night, one drink too many. But by the mid-1970s, it was clear that the life James Jamerson had built, the world he had defined with his brilliance, was beginning to drift out of reach. And though the music continued, the man behind it was stepping deeper into a storm he could not outrun. The consequences of James Jamerson's decline unfolded quietly, almost without ceremony, as if the world had decided to look away from the very man who helped define its soundtrack. In the early years of Motown, he had been indispensable the musician-producers waited for, the bassist whose name was whispered with admiration in studio hallways. But as the 1970 progressed, that sense of necessity began to fade. New players entered the scene, younger, healthier, more predictable. And slowly, James Jamerson found himself slipping from Motown's first-call roster. It wasn't a sudden fall. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic turning point. Instead, opportunities simply stopped arriving. Calls that once came daily began to come weekly, then monthly, and sometimes not at all. His brilliance was still there, deep, instinctive, unmatched, but the industry had changed, and James Jamerson's struggles made him a risk in a world increasingly focused on efficiency over soul. He continued to record when he could. There were still producers who believed in him, who understood what his playing could bring to a song, but even those opportunities grew sparse. The man who once shaped the sound of a generation was now fighting for the chance to play a few notes in a room that had once belonged to him. And behind every small victory was an undercurrent of fear. Fear of becoming forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear that the music would move on without him. His health deteriorated as the decade wore on. Trips to hospitals became more frequent. The once steady hands that had carried the weight of Motown's greatest hits trembled at times. His body bore the damage of years of alcohol use, exhaustion, and emotional strain. Friends and family tried to support him, but the battle he fought was quiet and internal, rooted in wounds that had gone unaddressed for too long. There were moments of hope, brief flashes where he played with the same fire that had defined his early career. But these moments were rare, and each one seemed to remind him of what he had lost. The studios he had once filled with life now felt distant. The laughter, the camaraderie, the late-night sessions they belonged to another time, a time he could remember but could no longer reach. By the early 1980s, James Jamerson was moving in and out of medical facilities. His condition grew more serious, and the loneliness of those years weighed heavily on him. He had given so much to the world, more than most listeners ever realized, but in his greatest moments of need, the industry he helped build offered little in return. The spotlight had moved on, leaving him in the shadows of a legacy he never received full credit for. On the 2nd of August 1983, James Jamerson passed away from complications related to cirrhosis, heart failure, and pneumonia. The news barely made headlines. There were no tributes on national television, no grand gestures from the industry. His passing was quiet, understated, almost invisible, an ending far too small for a man whose influence was so immense. Yet even in that silence, something profound remained. His bass lines continued to live on every radio station, every old record player, every memory shaped by Motown's golden years. And though he left the world in solitude, the music he created refused to let him disappear. The world had moved on, but his sound never did. The consequences of James Jamerson's decline unfolded quietly, almost without ceremony, as if the world had decided to look away from the very man who helped define its soundtrack. In the early years of Motown, he had been indispensable the musician-producers waited for, the bassist whose name was whispered with admiration in studio hallways. But as the 1970 progressed, that sense of necessity began to fade. New players entered the scene, younger, healthier, more predictable, and slowly, James Jamerson found himself slipping from Motown's first-call roster. It wasn't a sudden fall. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic turning point. Instead, opportunities simply stopped arriving. Calls that once came daily began to come weekly, then monthly, and sometimes not at all. His brilliance was still there, deep, instinctive, unmatched, but the industry had changed, and James Jamerson's struggles made him a risk in a world increasingly focused on efficiency over soul. He continued to record when he could. There were still producers who believed in him, who understood what his playing could bring to a song. But even those opportunities grew sparse. The man who once shaped the sound of a generation was now fighting for the chance to play a few notes in a room that had once belonged to him. And behind every small victory was an undercurrent of fear. Fear of becoming forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear that the music would move on without him. His health deteriorated as the decade wore on. Trips to hospitals became more frequent. The once steady hands that had carried the weight of Motown's greatest hits trembled at times. His body bore the damage of years of alcohol use, exhaustion, and emotional strain. Friends and family tried to support him, but the battle he fought was quiet and internal, rooted in wounds that had gone unaddressed for too long. There were moments of hope, brief flashes where he played with the same fire that had defined his early career. But these moments were rare, and each one seemed to remind him of what he had lost. The studios he had once filled with life now felt distant. The laughter, the camaraderie, the late-night sessions, they belonged to another time, a time he could remember but could no longer reach. By the early 1980s, James Jamerson was moving in and out of medical facilities. His condition grew more serious, and the loneliness of those years weighed heavily on him. He had given so much to the world, more than most listeners ever realized, but in his greatest moments of need, the industry he helped build offered little in return. The spotlight had moved on, leaving him in the shadows of a legacy he never received full credit for. On the 2nd of August 1983, James Jamerson passed away from complications related to cirrhosis, heart failure, and pneumonia. The news barely made headlines. There were no tributes on national television, no grand gestures from the industry. His passing was quiet, understated, almost invisible, an ending far too small for a man whose influence was so immense. Yet even in that silence, something profound remained. His bass lines continued to live on every radio station, every old record player, every memory shaped by Motown's golden years. And though he left the world in solitude, the music he created refused to let him disappear. The world had moved on, but his sound never did. In the years that followed his passing, something remarkable began to happen. While James Jamerson never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime, the music he created refused to fade. It kept playing in diners, in living rooms, in record stores, and on radio stations across America. His sound had already become woven into the cultural fabric of the country, shaping the memories of millions who never knew his name but could feel his presence in every note. At the heart of his legacy was the way he redefined the role of the bass. Before James Jamerson, the instrument lived quietly in the background, offering stability but rarely stepping forward. He changed that forever. By blending jazz phrasing with blues, sincerity, and a deep gospel sensibility, he transformed the bass into a true voice, melodic, emotional, and essential. His lines didn't sit beneath the music. They lived inside it, pushing and pulling with a subtlety that only a master could craft. Generations of musicians would discover this gift long after his time. Young bassists searching for inspiration found themselves drawn to the way James Jamerson played with curiosity rather than repetition, intention rather than habit. His style wasn't rooted in technique alone, it was rooted in feeling. Modern players describe his work as a conversation between heart and instrument, a dialogue more profound than anything taught in a classroom. Rock musicians, funk pioneers, soul artists, and even jazz innovators point to him as a turning point in their understanding of the instrument. The emotional honesty in his work inspired them to approach the bass not as a supporting actor but as a storyteller. And while each generation added its own twist, James Jamerson remained the silent foundation beneath their evolution. In music schools, instructors began referencing his lines as examples of how creativity could elevate structure. Students studied his phrasing on recordings, marveling at how he made complexity feel effortless. They listened to the way he slipped passing tones between chords, the way he pushed a rhythm forward by the slightest fraction of a beat, the way his intuition shaped the entire direction of a song. Even without formal training, he had achieved what most trained musicians spent their lives chasing: a signature sound. His influence reached beyond technique. It shaped the spirit of collaboration in American music. James Jamerson embodied humility, generosity, and dedication, the qualities that turned studio musicians into family during the Motown era. The quiet confidence he carried into every room became a model for how greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply walks in, picks up an instrument, and lets the music speak. Among the artists who worked with him, his legacy lived through stories of last-minute sessions saved by his touch, of songs that transformed once he laid down a line, of moments when singers felt guided by the emotion in his playing. To them, James Jamerson wasn't just a bassist, he was the pulse behind their most enduring hits. And for fans of Motown, his legacy became something deeper than influence. His sound became memory. It became the soundtrack to road trips, first loves, family gatherings, and quiet nights when a record player filled the room with warmth. Even those who never knew his name felt him. Because the truth is, you couldn't listen to Motown without listening to James Jamerson. For years after James Jamerson's passing, the silence around his name felt as heavy as the music he once carried. The world had moved quickly, embracing new genres, new stars, new voices. Yet beneath it all, the foundation he built was still holding everything together. It just took time for people to realize it. In America, the recognition began slowly, almost reluctantly, as musicians and historians dug deeper into how the Motown sound had truly been constructed. As they peeled back the layers of each classic song, they kept arriving at the same name: James Jamerson. The deeper they searched, the clearer it became that the man once overlooked had been at the center of one of the most influential musical eras in the nation's history. Writers started documenting the stories musicians had carried silently for years, the moments when he altered a song's direction, the nights when his playing breathed life into a track that felt flat, the recordings that wouldn't have become hits without his instinct. What had once been an unspoken truth now became a documented reality. James Jamerson was not just part of Motown's success. He was one of its architects. The release of television specials and documentaries helped bring his contribution to light. One of the most meaningful acknowledgments came when the Funk Brothers were finally honored in the late 1990s, long after Motown had left Detroit and long after James Jamerson himself had passed away. It was a bittersweet moment, a celebration of brilliance mixed with the sorrow of knowing one of its central figures wasn't there to receive it. Around the world, musicians began to revisit Motown with fresh admiration. European bassists dissected his isolated lines, trying to understand how he managed to create such movement within such tight arrangements. Japanese collectors searched for original pressings, fascinated by the subtlety of his touch. African and Caribbean artists recognized in his lines the same emotional honesty that shaped their own musical traditions. In these reflections, a new narrative emerged. James Jamerson wasn't just an American treasure, he was a global one. As the years passed, the cultural conversation around Motown shifted. People began speaking not only about the singers, the faces on the album covers, but also about the unseen hands that shaped the sound. In conversations about music history, the name James Jamerson appeared more and more, carried by fans, scholars, and musicians who felt indebted to the quiet genius who had changed everything without ever asking for praise. In classrooms, documentaries, podcasts, and tribute concerts, his story grew brighter. Young musicians who had never known the era he lived through expressed deep gratitude for the path he carved. For them, studying James Jamerson was not nostalgia, it was education. It was learning how to play with intention, with humanity, with soul. And perhaps the most profound reflection came from ordinary listeners, those who had grown up with Motown spinning in their homes, filling their lives with warmth. When they finally learned the name behind the bass lines that shaped their memories, many felt a mix of awe and sadness. Awe for the magnitude of his talent, sadness that he never experienced the recognition he earned. America and the world eventually looked back and realized that the man they had overlooked had been carrying them all along. The acknowledgement came late, but it came with sincerity. And while James Jamerson never saw the full extent of his legacy, the world now speaks his name with the reverence it always deserved. When the music fades and the studio lights fall dark, what remains are the echoes, small traces of the people who poured their souls into every note. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the gentle pulse of James Jamerson, the man whose bass once carried the weight of Motown's greatest stories. His sound was never meant to be loud or demanding. It lived quietly, like a heartbeat beneath the melody, guiding every song forward with honesty and grace. Looking back on his life, it becomes clear that James Jamerson never needed fame to make an impact. His legacy grew not from applause, but from the truth in his playing. He shaped a generation without ever needing to stand at the front of the stage. And in the end, that may be the purest form of artistry, giving everything, even when no one is looking. As we close his story, one question lingers. Did the music industry ever give him the recognition he truly deserved? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched you, or if you grew up listening to the songs he helped create, feel free to share your memories in the comments. And if you believe artists like James Jamerson should never be forgotten, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive. Some legends shine quietly, but their impact lasts forever.